Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Zendesk for hosting us. My name is Peter, and I'm a director of Startup Grind in London. And I just want to hear and see how many of you have been to one of our previous events. Okay, that's good. Some new people here. Great to have you. So really pleasure to be back after a few years of kind of lockdown and all that jazz. So really happy to have you. And for those of you who are fundraising, I hope that this event will be helpful. And if you need really any support, me and my team are here to help you with connections or advice or any way we can. So please reach out to us after the event. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Finn from Startup Grind HQ here, who is going to moderate and take it from here. Finn.
Peter, thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I just love in-person events. I miss them. And it's such an honor to be doing it with such esteemed guests. So for starters, we are in a beautiful, beautiful office as well. So thank you to the team over at Zendesk here, Brad and Jeremy. Maybe, Brad, you can tell us a little bit about Zendesk, welcome us to your home for the wonderful audience that's here.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, this isn't my home because I'm actually coming in from San Francisco. But yeah, I've been at Zendesk for 2.5 years. For those of you that don't know and aren't familiar with Zendesk, we're a customer support software solution, right? So ticketing solution for any kind of customer inquiries. That's kind of the core product of what we offer. And it's, you know, if you've ever used Uber or Lyft or Airbnb written into their customer support, they're generally powering all that using our software. Slack and Zoom are other good examples on the B2B side of customers that use us. But basically, any business that's scaling and dealing with a lot of customer support inquiries is what we do. And I've been here at Zendesk. My background, I started 2 companies prior, also been involved in a startup incubator. And I came to Zendesk after getting burnt out on my second startup and wanted something a little bit more enjoyable in the job. And it's been nice. And you know, the focus was to build out our partnerships with VCs and accelerators and organizations like Startup Grind around the globe. And then from there, I had the opportunity to start building out a team. And having a background myself as an entrepreneur, I felt like it was really important that we built a team at Zendesk doing this of people that come from that space, which is why Jeremy is here, who is going to give us this great presentation. And Jeremy certainly has been managing a startup accelerator for many years before joining us at Zendesk. So everyone on our team kind of has a background, whether they were as an entrepreneur, an accelerator, or as a VC, and it's really been important that we bring people into Zendesk that really understand the community. And you know, we're not just here to sell software, we're really here to support you however we can, and hopefully this presentation today will be helpful.
Thank you so much for that, Brad. Who's raising funds right now? Who's fundraising? Let's go. Show of hands. Okay, so we've got about 50% of the room, which is good. Who's raised funds recently? Good experience, bad experience? Neutral? Okay. You still friendly with your investors? Are they on the Christmas card list? It is being live streamed, so they're probably going to watch this as well. When we started kind of talking about putting this fireside chat together, I think between all of us, we support of course startups, we've invested in startups, we've raised funds ourselves, and it was a very interesting concept that Jeremy actually brought to me, and he called it like the snakes and ladders of fundraising. So I was like, Jeremy, that sounds like a game, right? It's like, no, there's actually like a really good thesis behind it. So to kick us off and explain the concept behind snakes and ladders of fundraising, Jeremy, why don't you tell us a little bit about the concept?
Yeah, it was fairly tongue-in-cheek to begin with. So I call this almost a thesis of experience. So I've been working in the startup world since 2015, co-founded and Entrepreneurial Spark. I don't know if you know that. We actually went through a huge acquisition through NatWest. Working with a huge bank is not fun. Don't know how to do that. But along the way, I got to work with thousands of startups, thousands of startups, and in their journey between raising funds and understanding the landscape, going out and doing the do like you guys have done or doing. I was there as that kind of fly on the wall, and listening to both sides of the equation, and listening to both parties and understanding, well, what are the VCs, what are the investors looking for from their point of view, but also how can we raise the level of our investment game and actually climb the ladder of valuation without doing too much. So how can we really portray the best valuation in our world to startups to the investor? And it wasn't rocket science. It really wasn't rocket science. So the snakes and ladders of fundraising for me was all about kind of, right, what are the steps that we need to take the ladders to go up the investment trail, to go up the valuation ladder? But then what are the things that you should avoid doing? So avoiding the snakes coming back down that actually decrease your valuation in the eyes of investor. So that's kind of where it all came from. In my role within Zendesk now, I have conversations with VCs all day. It's amazing to see startups as well having those conversations, incubators, accelerators, but it's all aimed at one thing, deal flow for a VC and startups raising capital and funds. So I think I have quite a privileged seat to be able to see both sides of it, and a unique insight into what people are looking for from that side of things, for you to really kind of take action and do something tomorrow that is different to what you're doing now to increase the valuation in your organization, right? And nothing hard either. It's easy stuff.
Love that. And now that we're all on the same page about the whole snakes and ladders concept or thesis, as Jeremy put it, Brad, two-time founder. You've been on that journey, you've raised funds yourself, you are now in a privileged position where you kind of sit at the lens of being part of a massive, obviously, organization involved in the startup space with the Zendesk for Startups program. What's your view of the current landscape that we're in now when it comes to fundraising, and what can founders do to really kind of protect themselves and make them really attractive to investors?
Yeah. So, if I think about when I did my first startup in 2008, and it was right around the time the financial crisis was happening, right? And it's like a totally different world back then than it is now. And I think the big difference is if you think about the entire food chain from the very top all the way down in terms of where the money's coming from. Back in 2008, there were only a few VC funds, like really large VC funds, and that has really proliferated since then. And so now, when you look at the world today, I'd say prior to 2008, there were large companies like Amazon, Google. They were starting to become a thing, but there was still a lot of skepticism about whether or not these technology companies were the real deal. And then as you look at what's happened over the last decade or so, you've had all of these other startups that have come about that have been successful. Some of the companies I've mentioned before, like Uber, Slack, Zoom. And then you get people that have worked with these startups that have gone on and made a lot of money and become investors. And so the biggest difference I see between what life was like, during the financial crisis when you have the big LPs pull the money and then all the VCs stopped investing and then the startup ecosystem kind of collapsed for a bit. We didn't see that over the last couple of years, and even though things seem to be slowing down, there's a lot more diversification in terms of where capital is coming from. So, there's a lot of more, the whole micro VC landscape is now a real thing, and so there's not any one person who's going to say, or any small consortium of investors that are going to say, well, we don't want to do any venture capital investing right now, and then that's going to just, crumble everything. So I would say that there's optimism there, that there is money out there. There's a lot of what I call dry powder. So a lot of VC funds raised money last year. I mean, last year was like a record-breaking year, and they have money to put out there. It's just going to be tough because they're now in the position of power, right? Like for the last decade or so almost, it was the VCs fighting to get the attention of the hot entrepreneurs. Now it's a little bit of the opposite, so they're going to set some of the terms. In terms of how to think about it, if I go back to 2008, I remember really struggling to raise money And a friend of mine told me something, and he worked at a VC fund that I thought was really interesting, which was when you're out there trying to raise money from investors, until one investor says that they're going to do it, there's no incentive for the rest of them to jump in, really. And if you think about it from the perspective of a VC, they're talking to you today, and they're going to be talking to you again in 6 months, and you're still raising money, then that's better for them to wait 6 months, because you've done more in 6 months, and if they don't have to pull the trigger yet, then they're just going to continue to wait, and there's no incentive for them to jump in if there's no one else trying to jump in. So to the extent you can kind of develop a pool of potential investors and really move them along at the same pace, so you can kind of get to a place where, you know, you're able to get that first check in, and then that creates the incentive for everybody else to pile on, and really finding that first check is going to be really, you know, important when you're doing that. And so that's, you know, I think that's a pretty important perspective to have when you're like, hey, I keep being in touch with this VC, and they're just not really moving things along, and that's why it's like there's no incentive for that. So, you know, you really want to try and figure out a way to create that incentive.
We're definitely going to come back to that point of core team in a little bit, because I think it's definitely a very interesting dynamics and where we see. But Jeremy, for you, who kind of talks about this concept of, you know, keep your valuation high, avoid a down round once you've kind of raised. We know a few people have kind of raised here in the audience. And of course, full disclaimer, you know, the views shared on the stage are not representative of the Startup Grind and or Zendesk. Just getting that out there. In your personal view, Jeremy, should a startup, well, I'm going to differentiate between a startup and a founder, because I always find it two different things. A startup is the entity, the founder is the person, right? So I'm going to talk about the founder being the person to begin with. So should a founder accept the down round?
Should they accept the down round?
And let me add to it, maybe, so we can add some concept, if that's okay, some context to it. And if they do accept a down round, on what basis should they do that?
Okay. So as you said at the beginning, right? The whole point of raising funds is being investable and looking like you've got the best value to go out to market with at any given position. Accepting a down round. I mean, if I put that out to the audience, you'd probably say, no, we're never going to accept a down round, right?
Wow, lukewarm.
Right.
Now,
Some of us may have done a down round in the last few weeks.
Okay, so I'm interested. Actually, can I just?
Hey, it's all about the conversation, the Startup Grind. If you're willing and happy to share, we would definitely love to hear your views.
Yeah, please do. Because if you've just done it just now, there'll be reasons behind it. And those reasons probably supersede my views on whether you should or you shouldn't. So go for it.
Survival. We were in a prestigious accelerator. We raised at a nice valuation. The next year we raised on crowdfunding at an even better valuation. Then we didn't get the kind of growth we needed to, and when it looked like no one was going to invest in us, and I've been hustling for a good couple of years, we found one guy, and he gave us a ridiculously lowball offer, and then I came back and I said, well, what about this? Let's say here was the last valuation, here's what he offered, and here's where we landed up, and as a result we're still alive. So it was basically take his offer or the company dies, right?
I love that. Well, thank you for sharing and for that honesty. What was your name, sorry?
Guy.
Guy, thank you so much, Guy.
Guy, I'm going to be a little bit controversial, and I'm going to say, you know, did you raise enough in the first 2 rounds?
No, I wish I could have raised more, but crowdfunding only got as much as we got.
Of course you did, yeah. But you know, when you're swimming and you're doing it well and you've actually got a great valuation, then I would be saying, listen, you've got to go out there and actually raise the most you can. At the same time, if you know you're going to need future rounds, you need to be warming up those investors that you've got on tap at any point. So if you're thinking you're going to raise in a year's time, you all should be having conversations right now with people that you want invested in you. Brad talked about the competition as well. In the snakes and ladders of valuation stuff that we looked at, it added around 200,000 to your valuation if you've got competitors looking to invest in you. and I would always have a good pool of investors that you can always go to at any one time, so you actually don't have to accept a down round. That's easier said than done, because when you've got survival on the line, of course you're going to take a down round, right, to survive, and that's probably the only occasion that I would.
Okay, I'm going to chime in.
Right, please do.
'Cause I can give you a really good example of a company taking a founder taking a down round, because it happened over the last few months here at Zendesk. So, you know, you go back, I don't know, maybe at our peak, at the peak of the market, end of 2021, we were worth $20 billion. And Zendesk got sold in, I think the deal was struck in May at $10 billion, so half of the valuation. Which, as you can imagine, being an employee at a company, like we were a public company worth $20 billion, and now all of our equity is worth half of what we thought it was. It's a tough pill to swallow, right? And you know, a lot of confusion, a lot of like, why did we do this deal? It's terrible. Like we just cut our valuation in half. But you know, as things played out, we learned more about all the stuff that was happening. It's the context that matters, right? And so if you looked at the same time that our company had gone from 20 to 10 billion, 50% cut in the valuation, our peers were dropping 60, 70% in the public markets. And so for us to sell out, cash out at 50% relative to them was actually pretty good. You know, and in hindsight, it looks good, and when you look at the way that everything went down, it just was terrible timing, because if we'd sold maybe 6 months earlier and cashed out then, it would have been great, but we had to operate in the environment we were in, and so yeah, you know, that stuff's gonna happen. So as you're thinking about like, oh man, should I, you know, these down rounds, if they're happening around you, that's just the reality. I mean, like across the board, you know, valuations are getting cut, and it's not just the VCs that are doing it to you startups. It's happening in the public markets, you know, especially in tech. And but if you take the long-term view, those valuations can come up. So my attitude about it is like, okay, so you know, we just dropped down from 150 a share to 75. Well, that's fine for me, because I plan to be here long enough that I'll see us go from 75, and we'll all get reset in terms of our comp and establishing a baseline at 75. And then from there, you know, who knows what will happen? Maybe 3-4 years we go public again at like 3 or 4x that, and it's a big boom for us. So I think it's okay from my perspective in terms of what we do.
Love that. And so whilst we're still on that point, but touching back on what you mentioned, that the current environment that we're in, VCs and angel investors, they hold the cards right now, right? They have the power. Obviously, things will change further down the line. That is the hope. Is there anything that founders and or startups now can do, right? So thinking like, here's the entity, maybe in your case, you was the founder element, the guy, but then there was also, I got to keep the startup alive, right? But is there anything that the startups can do that can be a little bit kind of clever in structuring their agreements when it comes to, you know, okay, the VCs have the power now, but maybe 2 years, 3 years, can we put milestones that if we hit these milestones and we excel, then, you know, we get some of the percentage points back. So are there opportunities for founders to structure some of their deals and term sheets now?
In a word, yes. And I think one of the big things that we're all scared of is are scary investors, right? And not approaching them, having a conversation with them about the potential to put in milestones, to put in varied agreements that when you actually hit those things, that you might increase the amount you raise, or whatever that might look like. Have the conversation with them. You know, when I talk about building relationships, you should be building relationships with these people that you can have these conversations with them. And building enough of those relationships to trade them off against each other as well. And say, hey, by the way, so-and-so, Antler over here, they just said that they would give us a decent term if we hit these milestones along the way. Then, yeah, absolutely. But it's up to you to go and search them and actually have those conversations. I talked about it not being a dark art at the beginning. It's not a dark art. It's a people game. The majority investments are done on people. Yes, there's a lot of numbers involved, for sure, don't get me wrong. But they're investing in you and what you're doing and where you're going, your team. And when it comes to, you know, the valuations, your team makes up around, and this is arbitrary, okay, so we went in for like 2.4 million. How do you get to 2.4 million valuation, and how do you come back down again? And within this, your team structure, your advisors, and the people end of it was worth around 400,000, which is a big chunk when you start looking at it. So yeah, absolutely, just have the conversation.
All right, let's talk about the different types of money and fundraising, right? So we know we're talking about VCs, angel investors, family offices, sovereign wealth funds to an extent nowadays, but there's corporate venturing, and we know these days the environment is sort of ripe for kind of big corporates to almost either swallow up, buy, acquire, merge, however you want to position it, for competition and or strategic partners, right? What role, Brad, for you, what role does kind of corporate venturing play in the current landscape that we're in, right? Are some of these corporate venturing principals or partners looking at thinking, this is actually quite an opportune time, right? Maybe all the VCs, there's dry powder, you know, a lot of the VCs, yeah, they're not quite ready to deploy their capital, but we're a corporate venture. We like to be a bit more strategic. What's the opportunity in that particular type of funding?
Yeah, I would say, and only because of the macro environment being what it is, that you're not going to see corporate VCs be as aggressive in this environment as I think your traditional VCs. Zendesk, for example, we've launched a corporate VC fund. It actually was launched in maybe March or May or something, but you didn't hear about it because we pulled the press release, we pulled all of the public announcements, and we decided to launch it quietly because of what was happening in the broader market. And it just wasn't a great time to make a big splash about your new corporate VC fund when valuations were dropping and we were selling at half of our valuation, and yeah, all this stuff was happening around us. But I do think, you know, like I said, with the VCs, they're a bit more insulated from that because they raise money and then they have years to deploy that money. And like I said, 2021 was such a big year for fundraising on the VC front. A lot of them are sitting on the money. And yeah, so I do think that that's going to be a better place than the corporate VC. And the last thing I'll just say about corporate VC is that most corporates don't do it very well, and you know, they, as you can imagine, trying to get everybody on board at a large corporation about how to do VC is really tough. And why the venture capital world works is because they understand, you know, how to structure deals and how to, you know, set things up so that the incentives are aligned. And so, if I were looking at corporate VC, it's usually corporates where it's basically the easiest money. There's no, you know, they're interested in just like your technology and they want to have insight into what's going on, but whatever terms you end up structuring with them are even easier than what you would have with a VC, because if they try to start putting in different stipulations or having a right of, you know, first refusal and stuff like that on if you were to sell, that's where you're going to get yourself into some trouble because you're going to start to limit your options later on down the line. And especially at the very early stages, you want to make sure that you have every option available later on.
Jeremy, perhaps you can kind of maybe add to that with sort of your experience with eSpark, NatWest, and all that. Yeah.
I think when you come from a corporate, well, let's talk about corporate accelerators and a lot of people who actually invest from a corporate accelerator point of view. Those that are linked to large organizations, because there's always something in it for them, right? They're there to sell you something. They're there to get you on board and do something with you. There are very few. In actual fact, I'll give a shout out to Block Dojo because actually it didn't feel like they were like that, which is quite cool. But from my experience of an accelerator that was funded by a large corporation, NatWest Bank, quite, you know, it's out there. They were very focused on opening bank accounts. They were focused on selling you a product, a debt product, and that was. It was right for some people. Like, debt's okay for some people because it actually proves if you pay that back, you pay that debt back, you've got what? First off, if you get debt, you've got skin in the game, right? That shows that you're in this for the long term. You've got skin in the game. That increases your valuation in investors' eyes. When you look at when you use somebody else's money, so you again you get debt capital, when you go out and get a grant or something like that, If you can prove that you are doing really well with the money that's coming in, and you can show that you've grown, or show that you've used those funds to a good effect, the valuation of your organisation increases in the investor's eyes. And when you do get to a VC fund, or you get to a larger round, then you're looking pretty good because you're good with other people's money, and that's the investment game. Because they're in it for an ROI. That's what the investor's there for. They want to know what this ROI is, and are you good for it? And if you can prove that with other people's money, you're good. You're good. Yep.
My question. So, what's your view on deferring the valuation question to a later date by the use of convertible notes?
I think you've done it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of it. I mean, we did it for our second startup. And I'll tell you, my first startup, we were very focused on valuation. And I'll just tell you, like, we went out in the markets trying to raise a Series A. And at the time, we were trying to raise, well, initially we thought, well, maybe we'll try and raise $3 million. That sounded like a lot back then, right, in 2008. We did end up raising $1 million. But we did it all wrong. And it's just the nice thing about being an entrepreneur the second time around is you learn your mistakes from the first time, and it makes life a little bit easier for you. But of course, we made mistakes the second time too. I'll tell you about that. But we got so excited, like got to the point where we were bootstrapping. We probably could have kept going, but we just got too attached to this idea of raising the money, and got far enough along with one investor, didn't have anyone else in play, and really got to the end of the finish line with this one investor. And we were so focused on valuation at the time. We were trying to price the round, and I think we priced it at like a $2.8 million valuation. I was like so excited, like, oh my God, these startups were $2.8 million. And and this is where I think it's important to have a really good lawyer helping you out, or someone who's on your side that understands how to structure these deals. But like back then, we were really structuring a Series A and negotiating with the investor, and the investor didn't care about the valuation. He was just like, oh yeah, you want that valuation? Okay, that's fine. But he did care about a lot of the terms that we put in place, and so one of the reasons I left the startup after 5 years, we got to profitability. It was a good business, but I wanted out because I realized that there's no way I could sell the business. And if I wanted to raise money from other investors, he had, he could veto that. So he had a lot of, investor controls. And basically, I just one day woke up and was like, oh wow, 5 years ago when we did this deal, we really left this without any real control over this business. And so that's when I kind of tapped out and said, okay, well, let me go try to do this again at some point. But that was, just thinking of being obsessed with valuation was a real mistake. And that's not the only thing to be thinking about. And just make sure that that's why I'm not a big fan of the corporate venture stuff either, because oftentimes they'll try to sneak in some of these, controls to make sure that they can protect themselves. So what's great about, 2008 was before you had these convertible notes and they're starting to pop up around then, but now it's become a lot more common. The terms are pretty standard. And I do think, you just keep putting off the valuation as long as you can, and it works out. We did convertible notes for our second startup, and that was great. We raised like 1.5 on convertible notes, but then we made the mistake. Worker instead of an entrepreneur, so that was the other mistake.
Okay. Just want to kind of keep going for 5 more minutes, and then we want to kind of pass on to you all for any questions that you may have to ensure you all have a chance to contribute to the conversation. I want to kind of change tact a little bit and go back to that concept I spoke about, startup and the founder. Founders are a lot of founders, and I mean a lot of founders. I mean today I've met a lot of founders in the room today, and it was fascinating. I think pretty much everyone I spoke with today, don't worry, I'm not putting any of you on blast if you've spoken to me, but there was a massive focus around, I've got to fundraise, fundraising. It was like, within the first 5 minutes, that was the first thing I heard, which was great. I mean, for us, Startup Grind, that's what we want to do. We want to know if you're fundraising. We want to help make connections. If they're valuable people in the room, you should know. We've recently launched a very small fund ourselves, so we're actively looking to invest in startups, which is great. But are founders focusing on the wrong thing, which is fundraising versus going out there and getting customers? Because that sage advice that the best form of funding you can ever get is customers.
Funding's a full-time job, right? It takes you away from the day-to-day. It takes you away from the operations of the business. If you're going to need capital, if you're going to need it, you know you need it for the roadmap that you've got ahead of you, and you can't do that with getting to a certain level of customers and business coming in the door, then yeah, you need to go out and raise money. But just know that it's a full-time role. It's going to take you away from everything. And if you're a founder, it's normally your job to do the fundraise. It's normally your job to go out there and have those conversations, which is taking you away from the team. So you've got to have some real trust in your team that you've got around you, if you do have a team around you, to actually continue and run the business and get it to the point that is investable. And continue that through the raise, through the round, and then at the other side, the first thing you've got to understand is, well, what's the roadmap to continue that growth trajectory that you've just told an investor that you're going on? And that's a really important point. So do we get sidetracked by investment? Yes, we do. There's almost this kind of, when we speak to funders, investors, and somebody says, oh, I'm bootstrapped, investors are like, oh wow, this person's bootstrapped. Wow, this person's got to where they've got to without going funding. And you become more valuable to that investor. So I would say, put as much effort in as you can, get to where you can get to through bootstrapping to get to a point where your valuation is actually in a better place, and you've got competitors out there looking at you, this guy got it, or whoever this founder is, they've got to where they got to through bootstrapping. More investable when you do need them.
Definitely that cap as well.
Yeah, I remember with my first startup, we could have kept going, and like I said, we fell in love with the idea of raising the money, and I basically got to a place where I either had to take the deal we had in front of us to raise the Series A, or continue bootstrapping, and I had people working for me for free who I didn't think were going to keep working for me, and I really wanted to hire them and be able to get in the office and do all that stuff, and so I think that was all super appealing to me, and looking back, I think that bootstrapping, if you can get to a place where you don't need the money and all you're doing is updating investors on your progress, and you get them to a place where they're coming to you because they are looking at what you're doing and saying, well, that's probably one of the more appealing places for me to be putting money right now. That's when you get into a really good place. Besides getting, going out there with an idea that doesn't have anything, maybe a little bit of traction, but no revenue or anything like that, where a VC knows that you're going to run out of money in 6 months or 9 months, right? If they think that, then they know that they can just keep waiting until that 6th month or 9 month, and then see where you're at and see where they can get you down in valuation. But if you can get to a place where you're able to build a business and put yourself in a position where you're not needing to do it on any timeline, and then you're just developing the relationships with the investors and showing them the progress and impressing them with the work that you're doing, I think that puts you in a really great position.
Love that. I want to close out on an important topic. I mean, you mentioned the role of founders is to you need to be fundraising the whole time. But I want to kind of just touch on founder mental health, right? We know it's becoming very prevalent now. We've heard of, I know previous founder we hosted from Monzo, Tom, talk about it a lot. What can founders do to protect themselves from a mental health perspective when they're really grinding it out to try and fund? I've got to raise, my startup's going to die, it's not going to survive. And are there anything that they can do to protect themselves just from a mental health perspective?
Certainly from my experience, there's been a lot of things that you can do. if I take the kind of stereotype of an entrepreneur, a founder, somebody who's living it daily, doing the grind and the startup grind, and really,
all the startup grind.
and doing it day in, day out with no breaks, with you live and you sleep, everything you dream about is that, then of course that's going to lead you to a bad place, both within yourself and also within the relationships that you have outside of work. I think the first thing that I would say is set your boundaries for your startup. Set the boundaries, the working parameters. This is when I'm working, this is when I'm not. Because the worst thing that you can do is lose the support of the people around you through the actions that you take within the business. So mental health 101, set the boundaries with your organization. It's only a stereotype that makes you work that bit. I know you're passionate. I know that you want to get it to where you want to get to. You think that if you put more into it, then you'll get more out of it. I think one of the things that I've seen is those people that do narrow down the time that they work on a startup, it's more quality time. Because those hours that you're tired and you're really grinding away, they're not quality hours working on your business. The more that you can get out of your business, I like to call it working on your business, not in your business as well, and put some people around you that can help you drive that in the business, then that's also going to help your mental health. When things are going on when you're not there. And that doesn't have to be employees, that can be advisors. Brad talked about putting a great legal team around you. Yes, that costs money, but also at the same time, that's money well spent as far as I'm concerned, so you're going to not go into the pitfalls of a bad deal. And just to, I guess to I'll put an example if I could. There was a guy and he had a lovely little widget that sat on every tap going, right? And he won a load of different startup competitions. And he thought he'd made it because he'd won these competitions and somebody had said, yes, I will give you 10 million. He had an amazing order book, but he didn't get the legal support. He didn't get the, he refused to support the professionals around him. And held within that deal from these investors was the fact that if he defaulted on any logistics of getting the product into the country, if he defaulted in any way, then the whole company would go to the investor. And that's exactly what happened with the the Suez Canal. Suez Canal? Is it Suez Canal? Where it got blocked. Okay, and he wasn't able to bring in what he wanted to bring in, and the investor turned around to him, took everything. And his mental health obviously took a huge downturn. He had to go back into the corporate world. Nobody wants to do that. So if he'd have just spent that time with putting the right people around him, it would have saved his mental health in the long run for sure. And getting people to actually look at that term sheet, understand it. And if he understood it, he could act on it better. So those are the hours that I would say to people, step back, understand what you're doing within your business to work in it, get out of it and start working on it.
I'll just share that, we didn't talk about this back in, when I was doing my first startup. It really wasn't a topic du jour like it is today. And I was proud of the fact that I slept on a couch for 6 months, doing the startup, and that was like what you did. But I'll say that it's really important. I bootstrapped for 2 years with the first company. We raised the Series A. Then shortly after the Series A, market dynamic shifted that made it really difficult for our business. It was clear that we weren't going to do as well as we thought we were going to do, or grow as fast as we thought we were going to do. And we realized that raising more money was going to be very difficult. So we had to shift from startup trying to fundraise to startup needing to grow up and become profitable. And so I spent the next year and a half or so doing everything we could to get to profitability. We'd sit down with our team each month and look at the numbers and say, we've got 8 months left, we've got 7 months left, 6 months. We got all the way down to 3 months before we started to turn it around. And at one point there was like $8,000 in our bank account, and we started to turn it around, and it was great. And then that's when we hit the profitability. But it was so stressful. I was so burnt out. I actually became completely unproductive for the last 9 months I was at the company, and that's when I decided I had to leave. And the reason why it's so important is I think you don't make the best decisions when you're burnt out, you're stressed out. And I worked so hard to build this business, and then 5 years in, we were profitable. It was a good company. I was so burnt out, I got out, and I didn't structure a great exit, and so I ended up with a really suboptimal, basically outcome from a company that was a great business and profitable for many years after, and got acquired last year, and I didn't get much of that because of the decisions I made at the time, because of how stressed out and burnt out I was. And so I think it's a really important thing to kind of be aware of. And I know it's people talk about it a lot more now, but it definitely can be something that can put you in a bad spot if you don't watch out. And I think that along the lines of that too, at least my second startup really helped that I had a co-founder who I was really close with, and we had conversations, honest conversations about where we were at, beyond the day-to-day. We had a lot of respect for each other. We both worked hard, and we were both very capable. But at the end of the day, you go through work, and it was nice that we had these check-ins. They were very impromptu, but we had these conversations, and just more about, instead of tactical stuff, which you end up talking about with your co-founder, it was how are you feeling? Where are we at with this? And it was great because we had an honest conversation the day I decided to leave my second startup, and that's kind of what ended up bringing me to Zendesk, and it was really a nice thing. He's still running the business, but we were able to have that conversation. Again, gave myself permission to leave at that time and start looking for something else, and I think it was a much better situation than kind of how it happened the first time around, where I was really alone. And I think that when you're when you're fundraising too, it helps to have a really great co-founder, because you can split the duties, right? With that startup, I focused a lot on the operations, helped out with making intros to VCs from my network and stuff. But he was like, "Look, I'll take care of all the fundraising. I'll handle, pushing that. That's my responsibility. You take on the operations." And so that's how we split it up. And of course, we helped each other out with both. But it was nice to have that co-founder. It's really helpful.
Great advice. Only thing I'll add to that is, of course, sometimes if you don't have a co-founder, you're a solo founder, create a trusted circle of friends, peers, other founders in the room. You can all share war stories of the grind, as it were, and just support each other. At the end of the day, whilst it may sound like snakes and ladders, it's a game. It's life. It's your life. The funding will always be there. It may be a timeline right now where the VCs hold the power, but that time will ultimately change. So look after yourselves and make sure you take care of yourselves. So Startup Grind is all about the community and getting the community to kind of contribute to this conversation as well. Of course, this is a Q&A. I know we were running a Slido. I don't think we've got the Slido QR code up, but I don't know if anyone on the live stream was watching. We're happy to take those questions. I think some are on Meetup as well, if I'm not mistaken. But if there's anyone in the room, we can maybe start off with there. If you have any questions for it, I will do the mic run around thing. Please feel free to say your name, say your startup, and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Chris, previously co-founded a number of startups. But my question is, in the current climate, is it a snake or a ladder to say to a potential investor that you only need 5% of a huge market to be a profitable company?
I think there's a lot of factors at play. I'm not going to cop out of this one because I think it's a really good question. I think if you can justify the number in the way that you operate in and the way that you're addressing the market and that 5%, if you can show how you can address that 5% and the journey to get there, then I don't think that's unrealistic, no. 5% of a multi-billion dollar market is a lot. So there's so many factors at play, but I would say as long as you can back that up and you've got the roadmap to show that, then you'll be investable at 5% of a given market, for sure. And you see it all the time. I think 5% could be quite big.
I'll just add to that investors aren't a monolith, right? So you could say that to one investor, and it's a snake, and it's a ladder to another. It really kind of depends. And that's why you have to have a lot of conversations with a lot of investors and find the ones that are like the right fit that really get what you're trying to do. And there's got to be somebody out there, you know, that you can find. And so that I think is, you know, a big main part of the game is going out and meeting and talking to as many investors as possible.
Got one here and I'll come to the front.
Yeah, well, thanks for the panel, guys. It's really insightful, and it really resonates with me. I'm Jim, and I'm a first-time founder, solo founder. Just started to get a couple checks in, but getting to the first check was really, really, really difficult. And you said with a VC and timeline, it's quite tough to get the first check if there's no advantage for them to be the first check. So how do you create that sense of urgency? I wish I knew. I wish I asked this before.
Yeah, I mean, we tried to make it seem like that there was a deal happening on a certain time, the second time around at least. You know, the first time around we didn't know what we were doing. We were talking to anybody, whoever was going to talk to us, and you know, we just ended up getting down to the end of the process where there was only one investor, and didn't leave ourselves with any other options but to take that money. I think that if you know, the second time around, we really ran a process, and we said, you know, here's our goal. We want to raise this amount of money over this amount of time. We did it with some friends and family. So my first time doing a startup, I didn't have friends that had money to invest in startups. So it was nice the second time around that there were friends to invest. So there was some proof there, and then also, you know, just working through. There's a larger ecosystem of micro VCs. So we were able to get you know, enough interest there, and then once you have enough interest, and you've got you know, whether it's a group of friends or some investor that's really bought into what you're doing, you know, who's going to be your anchor, then you start to develop a timeline. You work with them on that timeline, and then work to bring along any other investors and try and, you know, close the round and make it seem like if they don't get in, they're not going to have an opportunity. The round's going to close in like 3 months, and we've got 80% of it committed, and you know, there's a very likely chance that it will be oversubscribed and won't be able to get in. To the extent you can create that, that might be a little harder now. So I don't know if I have the best answer for you on that.
Create that form, we'll do that dance. Any questions online before I got one. We still good in person? Okay.
Thank you so much, Brad and Jeremy. Full disclosure, I did have a chat with Finn before the talk about being a founder who's focused on fundraising. So I was just wondering, from both of you, but especially Brad, without, you know, my co-founders and I, and the incubator that I'm an alumnus of, the 2 ladies here representing the incubator, our goal is to be acquired at some point in the future. So we have no intention of going public. So with us, just in terms of the current economic climate, especially here in the UK, but maybe even the US, there's an impending recession definitely coming to Europe and the UK. You know, with regards to, I noticed that with institutional money, once you get that first in, it's a lot easier to raise. But with us, we're really focused on traction in terms of market share and being first to market as opposed to being a profitable company or even generating revenue. So at that seed round and even potentially the Series A round, in the current economic climate, do you think VCs who either are in the US or in the UK and Europe investing in UK companies with traction globally would be keen in this economic climate to invest at the seed and Series A round in great traction, but just not revenue?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, like having a global presence, a global footprint, regardless of where you are, is a huge plus, right? So, you know, if you're operating a startup in an international market that was small and that's where you were starting, it might be a little tougher. But if you've got something that's global, I think that's a good starting point. You know, the talk now, right, and there's always like what the going sentiment is, and that's always changing, right? The going sentiment is right now is like, all right, you know, get profitable, figure out how to survive the downturn and all that. And that's going to be pretty important to startups that are in a place where they've maybe raised some funds. They're beyond that stage of trying to prove the concept out. and it may be a while before they're able to raise money because they have some traction, but maybe not enough yet on that front. So like they'll want to go and get profitable. But I think that I don't think it's ever going to go away that VCs are going to stop betting on ideas and traction. That's always going to be there. It's just not going to be that's not what everyone's going to be telling you. But there's still going to be VCs out there who understand that like they're looking in the long term, and even though right now like companies need to do whatever they can to survive, if you're in a place where that's not relevant to you, like you don't have a huge cost structure and you're not going to run out of, you're not going to stop, you're just going to keep going no matter what, then I think that you're in a decent position to be attractive to VCs who get that. So I wouldn't, even though we all say it, and at Zendesk we're like, well, if you're a company that's out there in the market, you're operating, like you want to do everything you can to extend your runway and keep the customers you have, right? So that's our pitch. And so we're piggybacking off of that idea, but that doesn't mean that that's what it's going to be for everybody. There's still VCs out there who are doing the same exact thing they did 2 years ago before all of this started to happen. And the rest of it is just noise. But for them, that's great because that's going to scare maybe other investors that aren't as experienced, and it might even turn away, founders, who force founders to do things a little bit differently. And so for them, it's basically like they have the leverage, and they're going to do everything they can to make you think that it's a really tough environment and super competitive. But that's the game that they're playing, and we're lucky because we were on the other side of it for the last few years, and so now that's changed a bit. But at the end of the day, they have money to invest, and they're going to be investing. And I don't think that they're like only going to invest in profitable businesses, so I wouldn't worry too much about that.
I'll pick up on another thing you said as well in terms of being first to market. There's always a massive trade-off, isn't there? Do we need to be first to market or do we need to be best to market? I think whatever you are, you have to be differentiated in the market, and that's what people invest in. Now and you can speak to any VC, any funder. They're looking for differentiation in the market. Yes, of course. Don't get me wrong. If they see a ticket that is shiny, it's new, it's something that maybe you're familiar with, then that is brand new, then they're going to go and have a look at that, sure. But I think the thing that you need to do is be differentiated in the market. The other point that I just raised in there, traction comes in many forms. Yes, I know. I think I had a conversation over here that VCs won't touch me if I don't have sales. Right? But then again, a lot of the companies that I've worked with more recently in the space sector, they're not going to get sales for another 5 years, right? So how do they differentiate? They're still getting investment, but traction comes in different forms, working with different people, organizations, building the advisory team, showing that people are interested in you, letters of intent, memorandums of understanding. All of these things add value and a goodwill element of your valuation, which can certainly make you look investable. So traction comes in many different forms, and yes, of course, customers are king, and traction through revenue is always a good thing. Yes.
Time for just two last questions. Okay, quite a few questions. We'll do one. We're going to try and do hot stop at 8. So quick, short questions. Let's see if we can do quick 5 questions, if that's all right. So we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4.
Quick answers.
Sure. Yeah, quick answers. Let's go.
Hi. Yeah, thanks to the panelists, and that's been really insightful, and thanks for your honesty as well in terms of sharing your experiences. My question is, I think Brad touched on the government grants. I know you may not be able to go into detail, but you sort of implied that there were some negative connotations to it. So I just wondered if you could share more on that.
Yeah, so my, and this may be foreign to some of you, but my second startup was shortly after there was this debacle in government funding in the solar industry. particular, with a company called Solyndra, that the U.S. government gave a bunch of money to, and the company fell apart, and it was just this really bad thing that showed up in the news cycle, and became politicized, and so that was the environment we stepped into when we decided to go and apply for what's called the U.S. Department of Energy Sunshine Grant, which is for technologies and ideas that we're helping to drive solar adoption in the U.S. And they had recently restructured the program so that instead of giving a grant where you earn the grant, you get the money, and then you go do what you need to do, they wanted to protect themselves. And so the way they structured it was that we had to basically demonstrate we were hitting the milestones from month to month in order to get our payments so that we can then make payroll. And so it was just a really terrible setup. And as an entrepreneur, it was tough because I was spending so much time. If we needed to make any kind of change to what our plan was, like we set up a plan 2 years in advance of what we were going to do for the next 2 years. And as you guys know, that doesn't work for a startup. And so we were stuck, like working through this grant and meeting the requirements of the grant in order to get the money, instead of like adapting our business the way we needed to. And so that was a really painful process. And like every time we made a change, it just had to get reviewed, and then the number of times we had to tell people on our team that like, hey, we're not doing payroll this month, this period, because we didn't get the money from the government yet, and so we have to wait for that to come through. And I mean, there were times that we basically didn't take pay for 6 weeks at a time, waiting for some administrative thing to happen so that we could get the money sent over to us. So that was just a really terrible program. It's a terrible, So I'm not totally anti-government funding. I think I wouldn't do it again, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't. I would just look at the way it's structured.
That was all off the back of the deal that went bad, right? With the government. So actually, my experience in the UK is a lot different to that, and the government money that they're giving away with little boundaries, little milestones, and being able to achieve those is actually quite straightforward. And I know a lot of the entrepreneurs that I've worked with and startups that I've worked with have taken governmental money and used it in a smaller part of that bigger roadmap. Okay, so being able to prove that smaller part and then going out and raising funds off the rest of it. So it's completely different for sure, and it's horses for courses, but there are people out there who will help you with government funding. In fact, there's a couple at the back who will probably help you out if you want to have a conversation with them later. But there's also, and I'm going to plug them because they've been great with a lot of people that I've worked with, TBAT Innovation. They look at that landscape they look at that landscape of government funding and tell you exactly what niche you should apply into, what makes a good bid into those, and then how to actually stack up against the milestones, move your company forward, grow your valuation, and also achieve what you want to achieve with some good free